Black civilizations before Abraham. Before the name, Israel, echoed across the pages of history, before Moses stood on Sinai and heard the thunderous voice of God, before the laws were written on tablets of stone and the ark was crafted in gold, the name Yahweh was already known. Whispered, revered, called upon. Long before the 12 tribes ever walked the earth, there were people, black people, who lifted their voices to the Most High. This is the story they didn't want you to hear. It's a story buried beneath centuries of erasure, colonization, and whitewashed theology. It's a truth older than the wilderness, older than the prophets, older than Jerusalem, a truth that rises from the rivers of Ethiopia, the mountains of Cush, and the sun-scorched lands of the ancient East. A truth that echoes from the lips of men who knew Yahweh before any temple was built. You've been told that Israel was the origin, that Mount Sinai was the beginning, that the law came first, then the name. But what if the name came first, and the people followed? What if Yahweh was worshipped by a remnant, long before Jacob wrestled with an angel, long before Joseph dreamed in Egypt, long before Abraham looked up at the stars? What if your history didn't begin with slavery, but with divine royalty? What if you are not a convert to the faith, but a carrier of it from the beginning? This is not just a video. This is not just history. This is your identity calling back to you. I need you to do 3 things, right now, before we continue. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a revelation. Like this video because it helps us reach people who've been searching for this truth. And comment on the number 12 below. 12 is the number of divine governments, the number of tribes, the structure of heaven. Let it govern your life from this moment forward. Now, let me take you to the beginning before the beginning. They say civilization started in Mesopotamia, but deeper than Babylon's bricks and the writings of Sumer was a people clothed in melanin and majesty. In the lands south of Egypt, where the Nile cradles the bones of kingdoms long fallen, the earliest people thrived: Cushites, Nubians, Ethiopians. Before there was Rome, before there was Greece, before Jerusalem, these were the sons of Ham, Noah's black-skinned son, who carried more than culture, they carried divine memory. These were builders, kings, astronomers, scribes. They knew the seasons of the heavens, the rhythm of the rains, and the language of stars. But most importantly, they were spiritual. Deeply so. They didn't just build altars, they became them. They didn't just sing songs, they chanted codes older than the Torah. And among their many invocations, there was one name they did not speak casually. Yahweh. Not the way you say it now. No, deeper, reverent, ancient. They may not have written it in Hebrew letters, but they knew him. Not through law, but through encounters. Not through sacrifice, but through fire, thunder, and dreams. You were told they worshipped idols, but what if the idols were planted later? What if the original worship of these black civilizations was toward the one who would later reveal himself at Sinai, only he had already been moving among them? Let's talk about the garden for a moment. The Bible says 4 rivers flowed out of Eden. One of those rivers, the Gihon, circled the whole land of Cush. That's Genesis chapter 2 verse 13. Before there was sin, before the fall, before Cain's jealousy or Noah's Ark, the land of Cush, Ethiopia, was named as part of Eden's geography. Don't miss this, Eden's geography included black land. Eden wasn't somewhere in modern-day Europe. It wasn't in America. It wasn't even in modern Israel. The river that encompassed the land of Cush suggests something earth-shaking. The garden of God was in or near black territory. If that's true, then the first worshippers weren't European, they weren't white Hebrews, they were black. And if they were black, they were the first to hear the voice of God walking in the cool of the day. That sound you feel rising in your spirit right now, that's not emotion, that's a memory. You've been told that you were cursed, that you came from paganism, that your ancestors were lost and void of divine knowledge. But the word says differently. Psalm chapter 68 verse 31, Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hands unto God. That doesn't sound like ignorance. That sounds like restoration. That sounds like divine lineage waking up. Let's go further. Long before the name Israel was known, there was a man, mysterious, powerful, untouchable by religion, named Melchizedek. King of Salem. Priest of El Elyon. Genesis chapter 14 verse 18. He comes out of nowhere, blesses Abraham, and then disappears. no father, no mother, no beginning of days, but he worships the Most High, the same title later used by Israel's prophets. Where did Melchizedek learn this name? He wasn't an Israelite. Israel didn't exist yet, and yet, he was called a priest of the Most High God. Let that sink in. He had no Torah, no law, no Levitical lineage, yet Abraham, the father of the Hebrews, gave him tithes. That tells you something powerful. Yahweh had priests before he had a nation. Melchizedek could not have been European. He reigned in Salem, ancient Jerusalem, but Jerusalem back then was not populated by the people you see on TV today. It was dark-skinned, bronze, rooted in Canaanite soil, which was Hamitic territory, which was black. You may not have seen him painted this way in your Sunday school books. But Melchizedek was likely black, and he was likely the carrier of a priesthood older than Israel. The New Testament confirms it. Hebrews chapter 7 calls Yeshua a priest not after Levi, but after Melchizedek. That's a spiritual genealogy Israel couldn't contain. That's a priesthood reaching back into time, and into Africa. So who taught Melchizedek? Where did his knowledge of El Elyon come from? It had to be oral tradition. Divine encounter, spirit to spirit knowledge, which means, listen carefully, that black priests were interacting with the Most High before Mount Sinai was ever set ablaze. They were not outsiders to Yahweh. They were originators. You've been told to seek him as a foreigner. But what if you were always home? The Cushday connection to Yahweh worship. Long before Israel sang praises in the wilderness, before David danced with the ark, before Solomon built his golden temple, there was a people far to the south, dark in skin, rich in culture, and already stretching their hands to heaven. These were the descendants of Cush. And they were not pagans. They were not primitive. They were not waiting to be saved by some future civilization. They were already aware of the holy. You don't have to take my word for it. Scripture doesn't hide it. You just weren't taught to see it. Let's open your eyes now. Genesis chapter 10 verse 6 tells us Cush was the son of Ham, the grandson of Noah. From him came mighty kingdoms, civilizations that built cities before Israel even existed. Ethiopia, Sudan, and parts of southern Egypt all trace their roots to Cushday blood. They built pyramids, they established royal bloodlines, but more importantly, they had spiritual traditions, some of which bore shocking resemblance to the worship of Yahweh. Go back to Genesis chapter 2 verse 13, where the Bible describes the rivers of Eden. It says, "The name of the second river is Gihon, the same is it that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia." In Hebrew, that word isn't Ethiopia. It's Cush. The land of Cush is literally part of Eden's geography. Stop and think about that. Before the fall, before sin, before the first murder, Cush was surrounded by one of Eden's holy rivers. That is not a mistake. That is not symbolic. That is geographic and prophetic. It means the presence of God hovered over black land from the beginning. This is why Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 10 holds such weight. From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshippers, the daughter of my dispersed people, shall bring my offering. Yahweh is speaking, and he is saying that his worshippers, will come from beyond the rivers of Cush. That verse wasn't placed in the Bible to sound poetic. It's a clue. It's a declaration that Yahweh's covenant was never limited to one bloodline. It was always larger than Israel, always more ancient, always stretching into lands where dark skin was not a curse, but a sign of royal lineage and spiritual depth. Let's go even deeper. Psalm chapter 68 verse 31 says, "Princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God." The same land others call primitive. The same continent they labeled as pagan. The same people who were stripped of their names, their kingdoms, their languages, are here prophetically lifting their hands to Yahweh. This is not an accidental prophecy. This is a restoration prophecy. The Hebrew word for Ethiopia in that verse is Cush. Again, not some modern name. Not a translation error. Cush, the descendant of Ham, is being prophesied as returning to the worship of the Most High. Why return? Because Cush once knew him. You cannot return to what you never had. The reason Yahweh speaks of Cush lifting hands again is because Cush once lifted them before. They may have fallen into idolatry later. They may have blended truth with error. But the original spiritual DNA, the memory of Yahweh, was never erased. It was buried, it was scattered, it was suppressed through conquest, colonization, and religion. But buried things grow, and scattered seeds always sprout when the rain of truth comes. Now listen closely. The Queen of Sheba, Makeda, comes from the land of Cush. She traveled to meet Solomon, not because she lacked wisdom, but because she recognized him. 1 Kings chapter 10 describes her visit. She comes with wealth, honor, and questions that tested even the son of David. But her land, Ethiopia, was not just full of gold. It was full of glory. Her people were deeply spiritual. Ethiopian tradition holds that she bore Solomon a son, Menelik, who carried the blood of Israel and the memory of Yahweh back to the south. That's not fantasy, that's legacy. And you see it echoed centuries later in Acts 8. Philip meets an Ethiopian eunuch, an official under Queen Candace of Ethiopia, reading the scroll of Isaiah. This is not a random African. He's reading scripture on his journey from Jerusalem. He went to worship. He is not a convert. He is not confused. He is part of a long, quiet remnant from the south who still honors Yahweh while the rest of the world sleeps. Why was he in Jerusalem? Why did he already have Isaiah's scroll? Because Ethiopia had preserved the name and worship of Yahweh long after others abandoned it. You see, while Israel struggled with idolatry, while kings erected altars to Baal, there were Ethiopians preserving the true name. That's not a coincidence. That's design. That's the hand of God ensuring that the knowledge of him would never be lost, even when his own chosen people turned their backs. Now go back to Moses. In Numbers 12, Miriam and Aaron speak against Moses for marrying a Cushite woman. Yahweh burns with anger at them and strikes Miriam with leprosy. Why? Because they dishonored what God approved. They looked down on Moses' black wife. And Yahweh defended her. Don't miss that. Cushite people were not outsiders. They were not less than. They were not strangers to the divine. They were, in many cases, carriers of something older, something purer, something sacred. And you, watching this right now, you carry that same inheritance. You may have never heard your history taught like this. You may have grown up thinking your people were always under, always behind, always lost. But history, when not told by oppressors, tells a different story. Your ancestors lifted their hands before Yahweh before Israel knew his voice. The rivers of Eden touched their soil. The prophecies of Psalms and Zephaniah spoke of their return. The priesthood of Melchizedek walked through their cities. And today, the remnant of Cush, scattered across continents, oppressed through slavery, mislabeled as cursed, rises again. You are that remnant. The spiritual fire in your chest. That's not new. It's ancient. It's the same fire that moved in your great-grandfathers when they cried out in tongues unknown. It's the same wind that blew through black churches under trees when no one else would let them in a building. It's the same voice that sings through you now when you worship with no instruments, no lights, no show, just spirit and truth. Because Yahweh is calling the worshippers from Cush again. And this time, the world will not be able to silence them. Abraham's journey south, Yahweh in Egypt and the Southlands. He was called out of nowhere. A man with no Bible, no commandments, no roadmap, just a voice, deep, sovereign, unshakable. Go, to a land I will show you. That was the command, and Abraham obeyed. But where did he go? And more importantly, where did he come from? You were taught Abraham's story began in Ur of the Chaldees, a pagan land, a place filled with idols and moon worshippers. But the voice that called him wasn't foreign. It wasn't vague. It was familiar enough to make him leave everything and follow a presence he could not see. That means something. That means the knowledge of Yahweh, however dim, was already lingering somewhere in Abraham's bloodline. And as he journeyed south, that name only grew louder. Abraham's journey wasn't northward. It wasn't toward Rome. It wasn't toward modern-day theology. It was south, toward Egypt, toward Cushite land, toward territory already soaked with spiritual history. And it's here, on this dusty path of famine and migration, that something powerful happens. Genesis chapter 12 verse 10 says there was famine in the land, so Abraham went down into Egypt to stay there for a while. That may seem like a minor detail, but spiritually, it's thunder. Egypt, though eventually cast as a place of bondage in later Hebrew texts, was at this time a place of survival, wealth, and learning. It was black, it was ancient, it was powerful, it held libraries, temples, and priesthoods older than Abraham's grandparents. When Abraham entered Egypt, he did not walk into idolatrous ignorance. He walked into a civilization whose gods had names, temples had systems, and whose priests knew how to manipulate spiritual laws. Egypt was spiritually active. Now pause. Imagine this. A man who just heard Yahweh's voice walks into a place where people already revere unseen powers. How would he distinguish the true God from the false ones? How would he recognize Yahweh's voice in a land where 1,000 others claimed divinity? Unless Yahweh's name wasn't new in Egypt. Unless echoes of the Most High had already reached the Nile. There are ancient traditions, unrecorded in most Western theology, that say Abraham was not introducing monotheism into Egypt, but reconnecting to a purer thread of it that had been known before the flood, and preserved in fragments among the children of Ham. What if Yahweh's name was already known, distorted, perhaps, but not forgotten, in the south? Think about Joseph. Generations later, this son of Jacob would rise in Egypt not as a foreigner, but as a spiritual authority. He interpreted dreams Pharaoh's own priests couldn't understand. How? Because the Spirit of Yahweh was with him. And what did Pharaoh say in Genesis chapter 41 verse 38? Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? He recognized something, and he gave Joseph power over his house. That's not just politics, that's spiritual submission. Pharaoh, a king of a black nation, acknowledged the power of Yahweh's Spirit in a Hebrew man. But rewind the clock again. Back to Abraham. As he journeyed, we saw clues. Genesis chapter 13 verse 1 says he left Egypt, very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. But what else did he carry? Wisdom, influence, revelation from priests he may have met. What if his time in Egypt wasn't just about physical survival? What if Yahweh used Egypt as a silent teacher? There are scholars, African scholars, who propose that Abraham's knowledge of covenant, sacrifice, even altars, may have been sharpened through exposure to practices already common in black lands. Not that Abraham copied idolatry, but that he saw in distorted form the shadows of a truth that Yahweh would later purify through revelation. Even Moses, the lawgiver himself, learned in Egypt's courts. He was taught by black teachers. Educated in math, science, astronomy, and yes, spirituality. Acts chapter 7 verse 22 says, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. And Yahweh didn't condemn that wisdom. He used it, redeemed it, transformed it. Could the same have been true of Abraham? We must stop seeing black lands as spiritually void. That is a colonial lie. Black lands were spiritually rich, rich enough that Yahweh sent his people into them not just for food, but for encounters. Don't forget this, Abraham's concubine, Hagar, was Egyptian. And through her came Ishmael. And through Ishmael came a lineage that spread across Africa and Arabia. And Genesis chapter 16 verse 7 says the angel of the Lord appeared to her. That's the first time in scripture that the angel of Yahweh appears. And it's not to Abraham. It's not to Isaac, it's to a black woman, an Egyptian slave, alone in the wilderness, rejected, weeping. And Yahweh meets her. And she names him. She calls him El Roi, the God who sees me. That moment matters. It's not an aside, it's a revelation. Yahweh revealed himself to an Egyptian woman before he revealed himself to Moses in a burning bush. So again, ask yourself, was Yahweh's presence absent from these black lands? Or was it just hidden from Western theology? What we see throughout Abraham's story is not a man bringing Yahweh to the world, but a man discovering Yahweh already present in parts of the world. Yahweh is not a tribal deity. He is not the invention of a single person. He is the Most High. And long before theology gave him a seat in Europe, he was already walking through the deserts of Arabia, whispering in the mountains of Ethiopia, and appearing to broken women in the wilderness of Egypt. And today, he is walking through your history, unveiling what was buried, repairing what was stolen, reconnecting you to a divine timeline where black lands were not cursed, but chosen. Not enslaved, but entrusted. The same way he met Abraham on his journey, he is meeting you now. You didn't find this video by accident. You were led, just like Abraham, called out of religious tradition, called out of ignorance, called into a new understanding of an ancient truth. The voice that said, "Go," to Abraham is saying, "Come home, to you. Home to identity, home to knowledge, home to Yahweh." Moses, Midian, and the African priesthood. He fled with blood on his hands. A prince turned fugitive. The man who once walked with confidence through the palaces of Egypt now wandered through the desert like a shadow, breathing dust and regret. Moses was broken, hunted, unwelcome in the land that raised him, unwanted in the land that bore him. And yet, in this wilderness of exile, something sacred was waiting. This wasn't just punishment, it was preparation. For 40 years, Moses disappeared into the land of Midian, a region not often preached about but crucial in the story of Yahweh. This land was not a spiritual wasteland. It was a hidden chamber of revelation. And it is here that Moses met a man, a priest, who would shift the entire trajectory of his life. His name was Jethro, or in Hebrew, Yitro. He was not an Israelite. He was not a descendant of Jacob. He was not born under the law because the law did not yet exist. And yet, the Bible calls him a priest of Midian, a priest of Yahweh. Did you catch that? Exodus chapter 2 verse 16 calls him a priest of Midian. Exodus chapter 3 verse 1 clarifies it. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And it is in this very wilderness, while tending that flock, that Moses sees the burning bush and hears the voice of God for the first time. But let's back up. Who were the Midianites? Where did they come from? Genesis chapter 25 tells us that after Sarah died, Abraham took another wife, Keturah. She bore him sons, and one of them was Midian. These were not strangers. These were Abraham's children, his blood, not through Isaac, but through Keturah. And what did Abraham do? He gave Isaac the covenant and the inheritance, but he gave gifts to the sons of Keturah and sent them eastward, into Arabia and the southern deserts. These children of Abraham, though separated from the covenant line, were not godless. They were not foreign to the voice of the Most High. They were raised by a man who spoke with Yahweh, built altars, and walked by faith. That legacy was passed down. Which means the Midianites, descendants of Midian, carried spiritual DNA. And Jethro, their priest, is the living proof. He was a spiritual authority, so much so that Moses, who would later meet Yahweh face to face, sat under his roof for years. Married his daughter, learned his customs, worked in his fields, raised his children under Jethro's roof. We don't talk enough about this. Moses, the lawgiver, was mentored by a black priest from Midian before he ever received the 10 Commandments. This wasn't accidental. Yahweh does not waste wilderness seasons. He hid Moses under the tutelage of someone who already knew him, quietly, without ceremony, without thunder. And Jethro wasn't just spiritual, he was wise. In Exodus chapter 18, after Israel escapes Egypt, Moses is drowning in responsibility. The people bring every problem to him. He's exhausted. And who shows up? Jethro. He watches Moses working from morning to night and says, "What you're doing is not good. You will wear yourself out." Then he teaches Moses delegation, the model of leadership, the power of structure. And Moses listens. He doesn't dismiss him as an outsider. He doesn't reject him as a non-Hebrew. He honors wisdom, implements the structure, and through Jethro's advice, the entire governmental system of Israel takes shape. So ask yourself, would Yahweh use a foreigner to establish the internal order of his chosen nation? Or was Jethro never a foreigner to Yahweh at all? There are some truths that have been left out of the westernized narrative of the Bible, truths that, when restored, bring healing and identity to people who have been erased from their own inheritance. Jethro was likely a dark-skinned man from the Arabian deserts, descended from Abraham, raised in oral traditions, formed in the knowledge of the Most High. His land wasn't covered in scrolls or temples, but his people feared God, worshipped him. And Moses didn't bring Yahweh to Midian. He found him there. The burning bush didn't appear in Egypt. It didn't appear in Canaan. It appeared in Midian, the land of Jethro. Don't gloss over this. Don't make it metaphorical. Yahweh chose to reveal his name, his voice, his fire, and his calling in a land outside of Israel. He could have spoken to Moses anywhere, but he chose black desert soil. And it was Jethro's wilderness that became the gateway to Moses' destiny. Even after the Exodus, Jethro wasn't cast aside. He was honored, welcomed into the Israelite camp. Sacrifices were made in his presence. And Exodus chapter 18 verse 12 says, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. That's not a footnote, that's divine affirmation. The priest of Midian sat with Aaron and the elders. He wasn't excluded, he wasn't rebuked, he was embraced. Because Yahweh's priesthood was never about nationality. It was about intimacy. Before Sinai, before the law, before Leviticus, there was a priesthood in Black Desert lands. A person who knew the name, who feared the voice, who served in silence. And today, that same priesthood is rising again. You are part of it. You don't need a title. You don't need a building. You don't need someone to lay hands on you and tell you you're qualified. If Yahweh is calling you in your wilderness, then the fire is already burning. The same way he found Moses among sheep, he is finding you. In exile. In silence. In humility. And just like Moses, you may not feel worthy. You may stutter. You may have doubts. You may look back at your past and see failure. But Yahweh doesn't call it perfect. He calls. And he will use your wilderness, your pain, your rejection, your isolation, as holy ground. Because Yahweh is still revealing himself in Midian. Still speaking through black priests. Still commissioning deliverers from places no one expects. And if you're watching this right now, it's not random. It's your burning bush. Take off your shoes. This is holy ground. Archaeological and linguistic evidence of Yahweh in Africa. Not all truth is written in ink. Some of it is carved in stone, buried beneath centuries of dust, hidden behind the silence of broken empires, forgotten by design, silenced by conquest. But truth doesn't die, it waits. It waits in caves, on scrolls, under ash. It waits for eyes that can see and hearts that are ready. And now, you are ready. For years, archaeology has been used as a weapon, twisted to validate European narratives, used to prove ownership of sacred stories. But beneath the layers of propaganda lies a deeper truth, evidence that Yahweh's name, his worship, and his memory were known long before Israel's flag was planted, and long beyond her borders. Let's begin with a name carved into stone. The Kuntilat Ajrud inscriptions, discovered in the northeastern Sinai Desert, are among the most mysterious and controversial findings in biblical archaeology. Dated to the 8th century BCE, during the Divided Kingdom era, these inscriptions mention Yahweh of Teman and Yahweh of Samaria. Teman? That's not in Israel. Teman is in Edom, a southern region associated with Esau's descendants. But even more stunning, some scholars have linked Teman and Tyre to desert regions deep in the Arabian Peninsula, areas historically influenced by Midianites and Cushites. So why is Yahweh's name being invoked in a land far from Jerusalem? Because he was already known there. Inscriptions show that Yahweh was not a local tribal deity. His worship stretched across regions occupied by black and brown-skinned peoples, long before missionaries, long before colonizers, long before whitewashed theology. And there's more. Ancient inscriptions found in Dedan and Tamar, deep in northwestern Arabia, also reference divine names and rituals remarkably similar to early Yahweh worship. These areas were home to people groups connected to Keturah's sons, to Ishmael, and even Midian. These were Black Desert lands. And these inscriptions date before much of the Old Testament was ever written. Still not convinced? Let's talk about Ethiopia. The Kebra Nagast, the ancient Ethiopian epic, written in Gay centuries ago, preserves a tradition that the Ark of the Covenant itself was brought from Jerusalem to Axum by Menelik, the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. While this account isn't found in the Hebrew Bible, it's treated with holy reverence in Ethiopia. Now pause. Why would an African nation not only preserve Yahweh's name but claim to be guardians of his most sacred object? Because they saw themselves not as converts, but as inheritors of a legacy that predates European Christianity. For centuries, Ethiopian priests have used the name, Exyava, for God, translated as Lord of the Universe. Linguistically, this points back to El Elyon, God Most High, used by Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14. This was not random. This was the result of an unbroken tradition of Yahweh worship in the East African highlands. There are even Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions found in parts of Africa, particularly near Elephantine Island in Egypt, where a Jewish military colony existed as early as the 5th century BCE. These weren't converts, they were Hebrews who had intermarried, adapted local customs, and brought their worship south. But even among native African tribes with no known contact with Jews, there are linguistic clues. The Lemba people of southern Africa are one of the most mysterious. DNA studies have shown they carry Cohen gene markers, the genetic signature of the priestly line of Levi. But their traditions are even more revealing. They keep kosher, they circumcise, they have a holy day similar to the Sabbath, and they say their ancestors came from the north, from a place of great temple worship, where the name of God was known. What name do they use? Some still whisper, Yahweh. Not Jehovah, not Jesus, Yahweh. How could a people separated from modern Israel by thousands of miles and centuries of history preserve that name? Because the truth travels through memory, through oral tradition, through pain, exile, and blood. And because Yahweh was always bigger than geography. The further you look, the more the evidence refuses to stay buried. In Sudan, among the Nubian Christians, Yahweh's name was venerated centuries before European missionaries ever arrived. In the Beta Israel community of Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Jews, ancient Torah scrolls written in Gay still invoke the divine name. These echoes are not proof of conversion. They are evidence of connection. The deeper you dig into Africa's soil, the more you find fingerprints of Yahweh. Not just in belief, but in names, in rituals, in language. Because Yahweh's covenant was never confined to one land. He made sure his name would not be erased, no matter how far his people were scattered. You've been told that worship began in Europe. But your ancestors were chanting sacred names while Rome was still burning incense to statues. You've been told that Christianity was given to Africa by colonizers. But your people were calling out to El Elyon while colonizers were still worshipping Norse gods and trees. You've been told to look north for your theology. But your roots were south the whole time. You are not borrowing this faith. You are returning to it. The ruins speak. The inscriptions declare. The DNA confirms. The scrolls echo. The language remembers. And now, so do you. Because truth always finds its way home. How Christianity was whitened and Africa was erased. It didn't start in Europe. Let that be the first chain to break. The story of Yahweh, the covenant, the priesthood, the miracles, the worship, the fire, it all began in lands bathed in sun, among people with skin darkened by centuries of desert wind and mountain light. But what began in the east and south was taken, twisted, recast, and painted white. This is the part of the story they didn't want you to ask about. Because once you begin asking why biblical characters suddenly look like European aristocrats, why early saints resemble medieval knights, and why African lands are only shown in bondage but never in worship, you begin to realize this wasn't an accident. This was a strategy. Let's be clear. Christianity didn't become white by revelation, it became white by reinvention. It started when Rome saw the power of the gospel, not just the spiritual power, but the political power. After centuries of persecution, early Christians, many of whom were dark-skinned, poor, and marginalized, the Roman Empire flipped the script. Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, and suddenly the faith of the oppressed became the tool of the elite. They didn't embrace it to follow Yahweh. They embraced it to control it. What followed was not discipleship, it was domination. The image of the Messiah was changed. The faith of fishermen and desert prophets was recorded to fit the empire's identity. And slowly, systematically, Africa began to disappear from the Christian narrative. Paintings were made, statues erected, Bibles translated. In each stroke of the brush, Jesus became less like a Middle Eastern Hebrew and more like a European prince. Blonde hair, blue eyes, soft skin, features that would not have survived 1 hour in the deserts of Judea. This wasn't about accuracy. This was about power. You see, when colonizers arrived in Africa, they didn't just bring whips. They brought Bibles, not the full truth, just enough of it to convert, confuse, and control. They erased Ethiopian scrolls. They mocked the Cush Day prophecy. They told entire civilizations who once worshipped Yahweh, "This God is not for you unless you follow our way." They painted Christ white so they could crown themselves chosen. And they used that image to enslave the very people who preserved the faith before Rome ever heard of it. They told Africans they were cursed, quoted Noah's curse on Canaan, twisted it to mean Ham's descendants. But the Bible never said Ham was cursed. They said, "Your dark skin is a sign of divine judgment." But Yahweh had already called Cush by name as a people who would bring him offerings. The whitening of Christianity was not just about image, it was about identity. If you can control how someone sees God, you can control how they see themselves. They turned Yahweh from the God of all nations to a tribal deity of white Europe. They erased Egypt's wisdom, buried the legacy of Sheba, burned libraries in Timbuktu, called African tongues demonic, laughed at African prophets, and in their place, they gave you stained glass windows and sanitized sermons. But you must know this, the gospel does not belong to Europe. The scriptures were not born in Paris, or London, or Rome. They were forged in deserts, written by men who walked barefoot, in lands where dark skin was not an anomaly, it was the norm. From Moses to Solomon, from Jeremiah to Zephaniah, from Yeshua himself to Simon of Cyrene who carried his cross, the story of Yahweh is wrapped in African soil, African faces, African faith. But history was edited. Art was weaponized. Maps were redrawn. And today, generations of African descendants walk into churches filled with white images, reading Bibles translated by white monarchs, taught by systems that tell them to be grateful they were saved. Saved from what? Saved from the very God their ancestors already worshipped. This is not to divide, it's to restore. Restoration is not rebellion. Truth is not hatred. It is healing. And when a generation of black sons and daughters begins to see themselves again in the story, when they realize that the prophets looked like them, that the earliest Christians were their cousins, that Yahweh whispered to their ancestors before anyone else wrote his name, they will stop borrowing faith. They will walk in inheritance. Because the whitening of Christianity was never about Jesus, it was about colonizing the image of power. But Yahweh doesn't live in stained glass. He lives in truth. And now the truth is rising. You are not the afterthought of this gospel. You are part of its foundation. And no matter how many images were painted, scrolls destroyed, or names forgotten, the blood remembers. The Spirit remembers. And now, you remember. You were never meant to worship a white god on your knees. You were meant to stand, anointed, chosen, a priest, a king, a voice that cannot be whitewashed. Yahweh's name among enslaved Africans, spiritual memory in captivity. They took the body, but they couldn't take the breath. They chained the feet, but not the fire. They silenced the tongue, but not the spirit. Because what was carried in the hearts of the enslaved was not just pain, it was prophecy. This is the part of the story no plantation preacher will ever tell. Because while slave ships crossed the Atlantic, while whips cracked over backs, while names were stripped and tongues forbidden, something survived. Something holy, something eternal. The name of Yahweh traveled across the waters, not in books, but in bones. Not in ink, but in blood. And it didn't need translation. It remembered itself. You see, the enslaved Africans did not arrive on American shores as blank slates. They were not spiritual infants. They came from kingdoms and tribes with rich oral traditions, with lineages of prophets, with memories of the Most High passed down around fires, in forests, in sacred groves. Many of them came from West Africa, where echoes of Yahweh's name still lingered in the language, Yah, Yewo, Yahweh, sound fragments passed down from generations who once knelt at altars under open skies. They didn't just lose their freedom. They lost their names, their scrolls, their drums, their language. But they did not lose the spirit. And that's what terrified the oppressor most. Because even when they banned African languages, even when they burned the talking drums, even when they forced European Christianity on the enslaved, something beyond comprehension kept breaking through. Call and response chants. Midnight hymns. Rhythms that defied doctrine. Tears that translated what English could not contain. And in those moments, they weren't just surviving, they were prophesying. What do you think the old spirituals were? Go down, Moses. Wade in the water. Swing low, sweet chariot. They weren't just songs. They were coded sermons. Messages passed down from spirit to spirit. Cries that carried the weight of memory from a land lost but never forgotten. Some of the elders whispered the name Yah. Some hid it in lullabies. Some scrawled it into the walls of cabins. Some prayed under their breath while picking cotton. And the most powerful thing, Yahweh heard them. Even without temples. Even without Torah. Even without robes or scrolls. Because worship is not confined to form. It lives in faith. And faith was all they had. Let this truth settle into your bones. The enslaved did not just endure, they preserved. They became the remnant carriers of Yahweh's memory when the world tried to erase it. They were the Levites in exile, the prophets in prison, the psalmists with broken hands and bleeding backs. And they never stopped calling out. Because deep in their soul was a knowledge the oppressors couldn't understand. This gospel did not begin with you. That's why, even today, when you hear a black preacher shout, there's a weight behind it. When a choir sings with no instruments, just clapping hands and stomping feet, there's thunder in the room. When a grandmother prays in tongues no one taught her, that's not performance, that's ancestral memory. It's worship pulled through generations of agony. It's the spirit of Yahweh breathing through broken bloodlines, saying, I never left you. And maybe no one ever told you this, but you need to hear it now. Your shout is not emotionalism, it's reclamation. Your tears in worship are not weakness, they're warfare. Your voice is not too loud, it's the sound of survival. Because when they stripped the slaves of everything, they still couldn't stop the name. Yahweh was there. In the sugarcane fields, in the rice paddies, in the swamp prayers and the hush harbors. He sat with them while they cried. He walked with them while they labored. And when they died, he carried them home. Because he is not a God of comfort zones. He is a God of captives. He shows up in prisons. He reveals himself in exile. He speaks through stutters and cries and moans that have no English translation. And he's still doing it. So if your bloodline carries the memory of the oppressed, if your people were forced to forget their names, if your worship was once outlawed, then understand, you are the fulfillment of prophecy. Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 10 said, From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshippers will bring my offering. That offering is not gold. It's not robes. It's not degrees. It's you, your voice, your tears, your worship, your presence. You are the offering. And Yahweh never forgot your name, even when the world did. You've heard the truth, not the version they taught you, not the whitewashed echo, but the fire that was buried in your bones before you had a name. Now the question is, what will you do with it? You are not just a viewer, you are a vessel. You are not just someone who stumbled onto this video. You were summoned, called by the Most High, drawn by the voice of the Ancient of Days, and awakened for such a time as this. You were never meant to blend in. You were never meant to beg for a seat. You were never meant to forget who you are. So here is the call. ## fire. I need you to do 3 things. Right now. 1. Subscribe to this channel, because this is not entertainment. This is a movement. 2. Like this video, because when you do, it pushes this revelation to someone else who is still asleep. 3. Comment with the number 22, because 22 is the biblical number for light, revelation, and the fullness of God's word. When you comment 22, you're declaring, I've received light. I'm walking in truth, and I will not go back to sleep. This is not just a video. This is a summoning of the remnant. And if you feel that weight in your chest right now, that burning in your spirit, then don't scroll, don't delay, don't wait for another confirmation. You are the confirmation. Close your eyes, open your heart, let this prayer settle into your soul. Father Yahweh, Eternal One, we come before you not as strangers, but as sons and daughters whose names were written in your scroll, before the foundations of the earth. You saw us through the chains, through the ships, through the silence, through the stolen names, the erased scrolls, and the shattered bones. And you preserved us. You hid your fire in our blood. You let the songs of Zion echo through cotton fields. You allowed us to be forgotten by man, so we would be remembered by you. Now, Yahweh, awaken every person hearing this prayer. Tear down the lies that told them they were cursed. Break the chains of whitewashed theology. Dismantle every altar built on colonial control. And in its place, raise up kings and priests. Raise up seers and scribes. Raise up worshippers who carry fire in their lungs and thunder in their hands. Let the dry bones rattle. Let the scattered ones arise. Let Cush stretch out her hands once more. Let every black son and daughter watching this video remember. They are not the end. They are the beginning of a divine reversal. We declare now that the same God who appeared to Moses in Midian, who visited Hagar in the wilderness, who anointed a Cushite queen to test Solomon, that same God is here, now, restoring his remnant. Let the spirit of confusion be broken. Let the spirit of fear be bound. Let the mantle of boldness fall. Father, raise up voices that will not be silenced. Voices that will cry out in cities, on corners, in churches, and on screens, declaring, Yahweh still reigns. And to every listener, I say this. You are the fulfillment of prophecy. You are the fire that cannot be extinguished. You are chosen, anointed, remembered, restored, and called for such a time as this. In the name of the Most High Yahweh. Amen. So be it. Let the remnant rise.